like to go ahead and get started. Moving in now to Unit 3, which is cells, which is Chapter 7. That's what it corresponds within the textbook. Remember, we're doing only sections 1 and 2 for the test. So we'll get to a point in the presentation where we'll cap it. We'll stop there. And then sections 3 and 4 we'll do actually when we move into the new marking period. And we'll either have a quiz or a test on the back end. But there's a lot of content in 3 and 4 actually, as we talk about the cell wall and the cell membrane and how cells let things in and out. So Chapter 7.1 talks about the history of the cell. So that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at some of the important scientists that led to the development of the microscope and our understanding of the cell theory. And you can't talk about the history of the cell without the guy who came up with the word, and that's Robert Hooke. He's historically credited with actually coining the phrase cell to describe what he saw underneath the microscope. He was actually looking at cork, and I'll have some specimens of that when we do our microscope project in a few days. Aside from when we make the wet mount, we'll also look at some prepared specimens, and one of them will be cork, so you'll be able to relive the exciting moment that Robert Hooke had when he first looked at that cork and saw the little boxes that made up the cork itself. He called them cells because they look like cells, like rooms in a monastery or a prison. And so the word stuck. And so to this day, we still refer to them as cells. Another important scientist that we want to talk about when we're talking about the microscope is Anton von Leeuwenhoek. He's an early pioneer in the development of the microscope. In fact, a lot of people consider him the father of the microscope. And he's one of the first people to see things that nobody had ever seen before under the microscope. And he called these little tiny microscopic objects animalcules. So he's an important historical figure as well. So all these little bits of stuff are leading to the development of a theory. Okay? Not the cell law, the cell theory. So remember, theories, actually let me throw it out to you guys. What is a theory again? Remember,
it's a bunch of hypotheses and other experiments.
Very good, yeah. It's a bunch of hypotheses and experiments that kind of unify a bunch of observations. And they put them together in a nice, neat package that explains something. So what we're doing is we're building towards an understanding of the cell, what's called the cell theory. Some other important scientists we need to mention are Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann. These scientists actually start to hone in on some of the specifics of the cell now. Matthias Schleiden looked at plant parts underneath the microscope and established the fact that plants are made of cells. Theodor Schwann looked at animal cells underneath the microscope and established that animal cells make up animals. And then Rudolf Virchow took it a step further and established from, again, other people's work, putting all the observations together, that all living cells also come from other cells. Now, this stuff is all so obvious to you, like, duh, I did this when I was in 6th grade. But you know what? Some scientists had to do this first. So a lot of stuff that we get to know and seems so blatantly obvious to us was not known until this period of time. Look at this, the 1830s. That's not that long ago. When you think about it historically, the United States already exists in the 1800s. You know, and in fact, a lot of what we learn about in biology this year is discovered in this period around the middle of the 1800s. They call it like the golden age of biology, because now you have the development of new technologies, like, for example, the microscope. Good quality microscopes. You cannot create the cell theory until you actually have decent microscopes that will allow you to see stuff. And the stuff that these scientists did with the microscopes they had is unbelievable, because the ones we'll use in a couple of days are far greater than what they had, but yet their contributions to science are hugonic. So what is the cell theory? Here it is. It has 3 main tenets. First, and these are, again, these are like so much stuff we learn in bio. We're like, dumb as Hannah, we already know that. But somebody had to, once upon a time, put it together. So first of all organisms are made of cells. So I'll emphasize that. They're the building blocks of living things, cells. And remember, when we talked about the characteristics of living things, this is one of the things we talked about. All living things are made of cells. So that's one of the tenets of the cell theory. Another tenet of the cell theory is that cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things. But those are 2 different words, structure and function. So we have to take them apart and look at them individually. Let's first look at structure. I circled it there. What do you think they meant when they made this statement, when they're saying cells are the units of structure? What does that mean? Who knows? The structure, the basic unit of structure of a living thing. What does that mean?
Like one of the things that makes up bigger things. So like a brick in a brick wall.
Oh my God, that's so beautiful. Yeah, it's what makes up the living thing. Like a brick in a wall. Yeah, that's what the cell is. It's one of the basic units of structure. It makes the living thing. That's what you're made of, cells. Then let's look at the other one, function. What do you think that they meant by that statement? The basic unit of function in a living thing. What does that one mean? So quiet. What does that one mean? We already established what the structure means. What about the function? Madam?
It helps living things like do what they need to do.
Exactly, yeah. Literally, that was so beautiful how you said it. Yeah, exactly. It literally does everything for you. You do nothing. The cells are doing everything for you. They're breaking down your breakfast. They're helping you move your stylus across the iPad. Literally, everything that's happening in your body now is because the cells are doing it. They're processing everything for you. All the metabolic processes that are taking place, every functionality that needs to occur in you is being done by the cells. So not only do they make up who you are, they're also taking care of business too for you so that you can live. And then the last one, new cells are produced from existing cells. That one's pretty obvious as well. Cells are living things, which means they also reproduce. They produce new cells. So cells come from other cells. And how they divide, how they create new cells, that would be stuff we'll be talking about in a future unit. But cells have to come from cells. So these are the three tenets that make up the cell theory, which is very simple, right? It seems so simple and so blatantly obvious, but this is a very important scientific theory. And it was developed over a long period of time through the contributions of many, many scientists. So what I'd like to do now is I want to show you a little video clip, a little 3-minute history of the cell with some of the stars I just mentioned.
These are microscopic animals and plants. Rather than being made of many cells, they simply exist as single cells on their own. These images have been magnified hundreds of times. The single cells are so small that you can't normally see them. It was only with the invention of the microscope, just over 300 years ago, that creatures like this became visible. Before then, no one knew that cells existed.
You know, the closer you look at things, the more amazing they seem to get. If I hold this piece of cork in my hand, it has a definite shape, feel, I can see the colour, but put it under my new microscope and... well, I've never seen anything like it in my life. This is Robert Hooke. It's 1665, and microscopes have only just been invented. For the first time, scientists were able to look at things too small to be seen by the naked eye, and Robert Hooke was fascinated by what he saw. Oh, this piece of cork seems to be made up of tiny compartments, like lots of little rooms all fitted together. Rooms or cells. Yes, they look like cells. Hooke became famous for being the first person to use the word cell to describe the room-like structures inside his piece of cork. He spent many hours carefully drawing their honeycomb pattern. Although Hooke gave cells their name, nobody knew what they were or even what they did. To find out more about cells, scientists had to be able to see in more detail. But the early microscopes of the 1600s just weren't good enough. It was 150 years before better lenses were crafted and a clearer picture became possible. In 1833, one of the leading botanists of the time was Scotsman Robert Brown. Having travelled the world and collected hundreds of plants, he made a startling discovery. There are so many plants, all of them so different, except except when I look at them close up. Every plant is made up of cells, and inside every cell there is a sort of dark, dense blob. Whichever plant I choose, it's always the same. I can find not one single exception.
Robert Brown called the blob-like structure inside each cell the nucleus. About this time, scientists were beginning to realise that all living things were made of cells. A few years later, in 1839, two German scientists, Dr. Schwann and Dr. Schleiden, came up with a theory which was to change the way scientists viewed the living world.
Dr. Schwann?
Yeah, Dr. Schleiden.
That's them. I think we have discovered something completely amazing. The material inside the cell moves about. Very slowly, I grant you, but still, she moves. We can only conclude one thing from this.
You mean?
Yeah, the cells are alive. Oh.
This got me thinking.
Sometimes a single cell exists on its own. But more complex creatures like you or I are made up of millions of living cells, all working together. All living things are made of cells, no matter how big or small, like a plant. Even this fly. Yeah. And the theory they eventually came up with was that cells are the basic building blocks of life. From then on, science has never looked back. As better microscopes have been developed, our view of the world has changed, and scientists have been able to look at small things in more and more detail.
This pinhead has been magnified by a modern electron microscope. Instead of making the pin hundreds of times bigger, it magnifies it thousands of times. At an even greater magnification, the speckles on the pin can be seen to be tiny bacteria, very simple single cells.